I don't think that there's anything in it for the United States compared to a truly cooperative world where we're actually solving global problems. The United States has spent trillions and trillions of dollars on these awful wars that it has fought. And like you say, it gets away with them. There is impunity. One of my colleagues at Columbia wrote a wonderful paper, a little disturbing, about the fact that the United States overthrew around 30 governments in the Americas in the 20th century. And I've watched some of those coups with my own eyes, by the way, because the CIA is an unaccountable organization. And since it operates in secrecy, it's never held to account for blunder after blunder after blunder. But we've overthrown governments, we've destabilized societies. In the African context, the CIA thought it was really important that Lumumba be assassinated rather than to have a true popular leader in the Congo after independence, that kind of thing, putting the country on a tailspin for decades afterwards, as if this is somehow good for America and so on. There are people who argue the line that, well, this is for the U.S. military-industrial complex or to keep vital resources and so on. There may be motivations like that, but it's so stupid because it does not deliver anything of benefit or security for the American people, actually. But it is a mindset. The mindset is real. I know the mindset. And the mindset, by the way, if anybody plays the board game, which was popular in my youth in the United States, the game of Risk, that's a board game where you have a world map. And the goal is to have your piece on every place in the world. That's how you win. That is the American mindset, I'm sorry to tell you, which is that we're not safe unless we have military bases everywhere. We already have them in 85 countries, 800 overseas military bases. It's not making us safe. It's making the world unstable. Yeah. And this is just a category error and a conceptual blunder, but it is the neocon agenda. I wrote a book in 2019 called A New Foreign Policy Beyond American Exceptionalism. I can tell you it was not a bestseller. I don't know how many people read it, but its effects I don't feel, because basically was saying this approach, this unipolar approach, this idea that America is the one country that gets to write all the rules, this is not going to deliver even for the American people, much less for the rest of the world.
Yeah, well, this also at a high cost to the American people, a nation itself torn apart. You've just had your own January 6th insurrection, and whilst you're spending billions of dollars on this proxy war, and we all know this is nothing but a proxy war, with the Ukrainians being the cannon fodder, whilst you are at the same time also moving to the bigger war with China. You constitute, 3% of the world's population, and yet you insist on this incredible dominance in the world.
First, we are currently 4.2% of the world population and about 15.5% of world production measured at international prices. So it's a rich country. It's a big country, but not a country in a position to run the world. China, after all, has a population that is more than 4 times the United States and an economy that at international prices is larger than the U.S. economy. And so how we're going to run China? Well, of course not. And that was the whole gist of President Xi Jinping's speech to the 20th Party Congress this week, which is the United States is not going to run China. And China has also a mindset. If the U.S. mindset is to run the world, the Chinese mindset is the other side is trying to run the world. Their view is that the West is tendentious and a threat. And they go back to Britain in 1839, launching the Opium Wars, one of the most remarkable wars in history, because it was a war to ensure free trade in opium in China, if you can believe this. But that was the British. And the British were the Americans of the 19th century, or the Americans are the British of the mid-20th to 21st century. Arrogant, by the way, very arrogant. And the British are still arrogant, though they don't have an empire anymore. They are still the biggest cheerleaders for the war in Ukraine, which is really annoying to me, because also I regard the war in Ukraine like the Crimean War, which was a war in which Britain and France wanted to teach Russia a lesson in the 1850s. And their leader at the time in Britain was Palmerston. And Palmerston just wanted to smash the British Empire. And that's how Boris Johnson or Liz Truss talk right now. Of course, they're a small shadow of what they were in the 19th century. But the language and the Russophobia, the hatred of Russia, actually goes back a long, long time. But none of this serves any useful purpose, and it all becomes vastly more dangerous in that the U.S. really has counterparts right now that are powerful, China being the main one. And China's rise is driving American strategists crazy. It's a kind of profound neurotic reaction right now, because the U.S. is supposed to be the unipolar world, and there's China. What are they doing there? They were supposed to come under the U.S. umbrella, but they want to do their own thing. And that is unforgivable. So we're virtually in a Cold War with China right now that the U.S. has instigated, because all of our documents, including one that Biden put out a couple of weeks ago, says China's the biggest threat to the international order. Well, you look at it. How about the wars since 1980? The United States has been in nonstop wars, more than 190 military interventions. How many wars has China been in since 1980? That would be 0. But they're the big threat. This is, again, kind of Orwellian mind speak. This is not honest, but China's viewed as a threat. So the United States is now trying to contain China the same way that the United States contained the Soviet Union. We're literally trying to choke China off from access to technology. I think it's incredibly naive. Yeah. I think it's incredibly provocative. Yep. And by the way, what we're doing vis-a-vis Taiwan is just like we did vis-a-vis Ukraine, which is we're saying every day, we'll protect you, Taiwan, we'll protect you, Taiwan, we'll protect you, Taiwan, giving confidence to the most independent-minded Taiwanese to say, look, we've got the U.S. backing. And now the president of Taiwan is saying we're a sovereign country. Yep. So the whole one China, two systems approach, which was the basis of stability of U.S.-China relations, being thrown out the door. Yep. But Taiwan is 23 million people, an island. China's 1.4 billion people, a nuclear superpower. Yep. And the United States is going to defend them? Well, are we really going to have nuclear Armageddon over this issue? And this is the kind of provocative foreign policy that the United States needs to stop running.
Yeah, and then we have Mrs. Pelosi, for absolutely no reason whatsoever, flying to Taiwan to literally poke the Chinese in the eyes. It seems insane and deeply provocative. And it doesn't deliver anything. Failure in Iraq, failure in Libya, failure in Syria. And, well, we also know that, ultimately, total humiliation in Afghanistan.
The idea is U.S. security depends on full spectrum dominance by the United States, that the U.S. can only be secure if it is dominant over every other country and every other region of the world. Now, no other country lives in those conditions. No country has security because of full spectrum dominance, and the U.S. has an illusion that it has full spectrum dominance. So what the U.S. needs to, and when I say the U.S., of course, we're not talking about populations, we're talking about small numbers of leaders of the permanent state. We're not even necessarily talking about presidents, by the way, because this is foreign policy doctrine of the Pentagon and the security institutions of the United States. Politicians come and go, but this has been doctrine for a long time. And the point is that the U.S. wants a kind of security that it would absolutely deny to the other 96% of the world. It doesn't say to the only thing the U.S. says to the rest of you want security, you follow us. We'll be the security. Of course, then you have to follow us. You can't have any ideas of your own. And when we need certain things, you'll grant them because we're us. And so it's a certain asymmetry, which I think is a dangerous asymmetry.
Professor Sachs, we are running out of time here. I want to just return to my opening questions to you. I guess I'm asking for confirmation on the two simple yet central questions of this discussion. In your own words, is it false to claim and utterly disingenuous to claim that this conflict in Ukraine is the result of an unprovoked invasion, as is being stated in the mainstream media and the US NATO leadership on a daily basis, an unprovoked invasion by the Russians? And number two, that Vladimir Putin is a modern-day Hitler, hell-bent on the restoration of Russian power, which necessitates the grabbing of land.
This is a war that has been a hot war since 2014 and an absolutely avoidable war. And if Ukraine had followed a path of neutrality with security guarantees, as was on the table as late as March of this year, this horrible war could have been avoided altogether or stopped early on. And we should listen because we need to negotiate with Russia and with President Putin as the president of Russia. We need to negotiate because we need this war to end before it ends us.
One last question, Professor Sachs, your view. I believe, like I think many millions of other people around the world, that this war can in fact be stopped today. It can end today if the United States of America will allow that. That it is in the hands of the United States of America to stop this war today.
This war could stop now. And in March, the two sides, with the brilliant mediation of Turkey, actually were exchanging documents to end the war. And then Ukraine walked away from the negotiating table. Best guess, because their American patrons said, you should fight. You don't have to take neutrality. You should fight. And we were close to this war ending in March. It could have been avoided last December had Biden said, we are not expanding NATO. We hear you. No need to do that. We can have peace and cooperation, and it can end now. And it needs to, because otherwise it will continue to escalate. The first damage will be the destruction of Ukraine itself, its people, its physical infrastructure, its buildings, all of the suffering. But this is beyond Ukraine. This is escalating towards nuclear confrontation. The Ukrainians are urging that we keep escalating, and if a more general war breaks out, they write that NATO should attack Russia. This is mind-bogglingly wrong-headed and dangerous. We all have a stake in this war ending now.
We have 1 minute left, Professor Sachs. Who blew up the pipeline?
The United States blew up the pipeline. They told us that they were going to. Biden was standing next to Chancellor Scholz and said, if Russia invades, Nord Stream is finished. And a reporter said to him, Mr. President, that's a Russian-German project. How can you say that? And President Biden said, we have our ways. So that's the presumption until proven otherwise. Lo and behold, the Europeans can't figure out who did it. Lo and behold, the Swedes can't even share their intelligence with Denmark and Germany. The fingerprints are all over this thing. I believe that the overwhelming likelihood is the U.S. did it and tried to point otherwise, but we'll probably hear soon from the Europeans, it was sabotage, but the trail has run cold. We just can't figure out who did it. That's what we're probably going to hear as more patter from the U.S.-led information system.
The war continues, the destruction continues, and yeah, what I want to know is there any sign whatsoever in your mind, something that you've observed that you might point to that will give us hope that sanity ultimately will prevail?
You know, sanity can prevail because clear-thinking people all over the world know how dangerous this is. And we need to keep pushing and need to keep saying, stop the war. And this is for the sake of all humanity, not only for those immediately suffering, but the whole world is at risk as long as this war continues. What we're experiencing right now is a great power confrontation. So it's not merely in quotation marks, a Russian war in Ukraine or Russian invasion of Ukraine. It is a U.S.-Russia confrontation. But what's striking is that the U.S. is engaged in two fronts, one with Russia, the other with China. And we're seeing a lot of belligerency by the United States towards China in recent years as well. This started around 2014, roughly actually the time of those events in Ukraine, but really for somewhat different reasons, but are also escalating. And today there's news reports that I find, if it weren't so deadly and dangerous, I'd find it satirical. It's stories in the mainstream media saying, don't worry, the Ukraine war is not going to divert American attention from China. In other words, we're still going to have an antagonistic view to China. We're still going to make alliances in Asia. Don't worry. And this is explaining that we can do both. We can confront Russia. We can confront China. And I'm saying, oh, my God, is this for real? Do we really want World War III? Is this our death wish? Is this our insanity? Is this our craziness of our exceptionalism? But there is this feeling. We're in a two-front feeling in the U.S., and they're trying to talk NATO into opening an Asia mission. In fact, the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, has said in the past year that NATO is going to direct its attention to China. Now, all of this is incredibly important for climate because China is essential for global climate policy, for cooperation, for every dimension of the climate crisis. China by itself can wreck the global climate because it emits about 28% of the greenhouse gases, in the United States about 14%. But just remember, since they're 4 times larger than we are in population, our per capita impact is much, much larger. But China better get this under control or we have a disaster. So are we sitting down to talk with China about this? Are we working out common systems? Are we working out technology standards? Are we agreeing to co-finance projects for decarbonization around the world? Well, I think you could probably guess the answer is no to all of those. We are changing the rhetoric regarding Taiwan. We are drumming up a drumbeat on Taiwan whenever, in the rare moments when U.S. so-called diplomats, but I don't find them very diplomatic, meet with Chinese counterparts, almost the first word out of their mouth is Taiwan, because what they want to do is, I don't know why, but they want to annoy and provoke China, and probably, and it could not be more dangerous, encourage Taiwan into some kind of adventure that would be incredibly dangerous for Taiwan. I admire Taiwan enormously. And because of that, I would keep the temperature down so that there is no tension, rather than raising the temperature, which I think can only hurt every dimension of this. Now, I was just speaking with the specialized funds around the world addressing some of the core sustainable development issues: the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria, and so forth. And what they're saying is the war in Ukraine is causing donors to say, you know what, we promised you, we can't really deliver, so we're going to be late. You have to understand, we have a rising military budget, we have a crisis, refugees. Well, this is what war does. War crowds out, even, I mean, literally survival, but it crowds out any kind of longer term thinking. And climate requires 30 years of investment in a concerted way, in a cooperative manner, in a trans-border manner. You don't decarbonize on a whim. You have to make plans. You have to invest in new power systems, power generation, transmission systems, grids that take 10, 15, 20 years to bring to fruition. So all of this makes the climate agenda fraught. And also in the short term, of course, it's bizarre. You have the Biden administration, which came into office as a climate champion, trying to raise production of fossil fuels and say, go for it, because we have to offset the production that we're trying to keep from being exported from Russia. So politically, you turn on the spigot again, rather than saying, no, you should be phasing out and phasing in something else. We say, go for it. Go for the coal, oil, and gas, because that will defeat Russia. And this is, these politicians are really going to be the end of us unless we are able to get a politics that really works for our well-being, not a politics that works for their incredibly short-run horizons.
Yeah, there have been many calls in Europe and elsewhere to speed up the transition to renewable energy as a result of this war. I know you've been skeptical in other interviews that this war will actually inspire that kind of necessary action. I mean, how has the decision to end Russian fossil fuel imports impacted the clean energy transition here and abroad?
I would say again that the first thing is it just distracts, because if you want to make a transition, you need clear long-term thinking. Clear long-term thinking, at least for me, requires some quiet. Okay, we need to think through 10 years, 20 years, what are we going to do? But with war, it's day to day, it's improvisation, it's budgets that are shifted for armaments. And in a very practical way, it's reopening coal mines, reopening fracking, reopening gas fields, because you scramble in the short term when energy prices soar, which they have soared in recent weeks. And with sudden cutoffs of Russian gas, well, now Europe is taking whatever actions it can to keep the lights on, to keep the air conditioning on this summer, and so forth. And that means that we're not in a long-term planning mode. You could say, and there is a certain sense, well, Russia shouldn't be exporting fossil fuels for the long term. So all of this is in the direction of long-term change. And indeed, I said to Russian friends and the Russian government for years, of course you have to decarbonize. There cannot be a petro state in 2050. There can be a solar state, there can be wind power, hydropower, hydrogen economy, but there cannot be a petro state. And in a way, yes, this points in that direction. But the problem is that the transformations that we need require organization, planning, and long-term finance, and war works against all of that.
I want to switch topics quickly here because I'd love to get your thoughts on the inflation that America is facing today. How will passing parts of President Biden's Build Back Better agenda, especially the parts related to investing in the clean energy transition, impact inflation?
You know, the basic point with inflation is that we have a holy mess that's come together to put us back into what's called stagflation. Higher prices, rising prices at a rapid pace, combined with an economy which is strong at the moment, but is absolutely going to slow down, maybe even have a hard landing. And worldwide, we'll have more inflation and even another downturn. Europe probably is already in a downturn because of the war hitting Europe even harder. Well, I came into economics actually 42 years ago when I joined the faculty at Harvard University. My first book was called The Economics of Worldwide Stagflation. It was studying this kind of phenomenon. The 1970s was a period of war. The Yom Kippur War in Israel against its Arab neighbors, for example, the Arab oil embargo, which is not so different from what's happening now, a breakdown of monetary arrangements, which were then called the Bretton Woods system, because it was under the IMF that the US dollar played a particular role in international monetary affairs. So there was this incredible confluence of monetary, fiscal, geopolitical, and resource shocks that came together and produced a stagflation, which was worth writing a book about. So here we are again. We are in a stagflationary mode. Interestingly, the Federal Reserve really had pumped up the money supply for many, many years. And especially after COVID hit. In fact, in two phases, one after the 2008 great crunch, the financial crisis, and then again in 2020, even more remarkably in certain ways, the Fed pumped in money and nothing really happened on inflation except Bitcoin prices went up or stock market prices went up or some asset value prices went up, but prices in the street didn't seem to go up very much. And so there was the modern monetary theory. Oh, we could just print money to our heart's content. And as a monetary economist, I was scratching my head, frankly, saying, how could the money supply go up so much and not have inflation? Well, there is some mystery to that. There remains in disentangling all of this. But I would say the following. We've had a huge increase of the money supply by the Fed. We've had two huge supply shocks, COVID and the war. And the result now is that we are in an inflationary period that is painful and that is familiar in certain ways, more familiar perhaps than how macro looked 2 or 3 years ago. And what does all of this mean? It means, first of all, the world economy is unstable. That goes along with the war also. That goes along with the sanctions regime. That goes along with geopolitical tension. I don't like any of it because it makes everything much harder and it really hits poor countries very, very hard. So we're going to have a lot of debt crises coming up if we don't decisively take measures to head those off. Second, the inflation's likely to continue for a while because the underlying factors are not going to go away. Third, we need to sort out the basics. For me, the first basic is end this war. Second basic is end the taunting and the provocations of China, and some specific measures like the Trump tariffs that were put on Chinese goods that raised prices, by the way, but also created a trade war. Third, I've said now, I can't tell you how many decades, if we want to fund things to make our society decent, we have to raise taxes. You can't do it by printing money, and you can't do it just by debt. So this is a third point that becomes quite important. All really important good things, like decarbonizing the energy system, are affordable by definition. We can't afford not to do them. We will completely wreck the planet. In fact, decarbonizing the energy system requires perhaps a percentage point, even arguably a little bit more than that, per year of GDP in incremental outlays. Maybe, okay, it could be even more than that on some accounts. That's absolutely affordable. But we should have a tax system that is compatible with our spending needs. There's a lot of saving, by the way, that we should be doing in this country. I testified in Congress recently on the fact that our healthcare costs are roughly twice what they should be. We spend 2 times more than our peer countries on hospitalization days, on procedures, on medicines and so forth, because we have a quite monopolized, privately owned healthcare system in this country, which has a lot of market power to jack up prices. All of this is to say the Build Back Better agenda is right, because those are about long-term structural changes. I argued, good, it's right, raise taxes to pay for them. That's the right way to do this. Whether we see another major piece of legislation in this country for years to come, I think is quite doubtful right now. I doubt that the Democrats will pass anything before November. Looks like the Democrats will lose one or both houses of Congress. If the Supreme Court goes the way that it seems to be going, we're going to have just a mass of social conflict in this country. Also, we could be many years without a serious piece of legislation in this country, which is completely dreadful. And that's why being engaged in a war with all the things we need to do is just the cruelest, misguided misunderstanding about the role of politics imaginable. And I just am so disappointed in Biden and so disappointed in his mindset that he didn't understand that we need to rebuild the United States, cooperate with other countries, and use diplomacy to head off war, not just Stinger and Javelin weaponry to head off war. And I find it extremely disappointing that we are where we are, and very dangerous. I'll start with, again, the same data that I mentioned earlier, but for the US and China. If you measure output in China and the US at what's called international prices, a common set of prices, or what's called purchasing adjusted prices, the Chinese economy is bigger than the US economy. China is currently about 18% of world output, and the US is about 15.5% of world output. This is a fundamental change from 40 years ago. In 1980, the US was about 21% of world output, and China was about 2.5% of world output. Between 1980 and 2020, China grew at a rate of nearly 10% per year. When you have economic growth at 10% per year, it means your economy doubles in size every 7 years. So in 35 years, it doubles 5 times, or 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, 32-time increase. And that's basically what happened with China. Why, by the way? Because China started incredibly poor, and it caught up to a significant extent. When you're poor, there's lots of headroom. Electrification, education, building roads, building rail, and that's what China did extremely effectively for 40 years. Excellent economic management for 40 years. And now, they didn't close the gap in living standards because the living standards, by this measure that I keep referring to, puts China at about 30% of the US level. But since China's 4 times the population, it makes it a larger economy in total. Well, let me just give you the upshot of this. This is freaking out American policymakers. It's what a psychologist or a psychiatrist would call a neurotic reaction. Because no one gave China the permission to be bigger than the United States. And that wasn't supposed to happen. In 1992, the US achieved unipolar status, the sole superpower. And that was supposed to last for many decades. And lo and behold, 30 years later, it ended. And the American reaction is, we are so smart, we are so good, we are so effective, that China must really have cheated at every moment. And they really must be our enemy also. This is extremely dangerous. It's either us or them at the top of the world. And only a US-led world is a safe world. Otherwise, we're all going to be destroyed by China. It is, in my view, a fantasy misunderstanding. I'll start again with the basic proposition. China's living standards are about a third of the US. China has decades of economic development to make. China faces major challenges. Population is now starting to decline quite significantly. China will probably be under 1 billion people by the end of this century, possibly 800 million, according to the UN forecasts, which are mechanical, but still showing how significant. China will age very rapidly. There are many, many challenges. China's not out to take over the world. But the U.S. whole vision is U.S. is the world leader. It's the self-image. It's what I'm afraid is taught at the Kennedy School of Government often.
My question would be the following one. If we assume that this conflict is going to end in a way that's not going to be a defeat, an explicit defeat of Russia, do you see that having any consequences of the future role of dollar as an international currency? And what do you think is going to happen on the US Treasury bond market in the future? Thank you.
Just in a general word about the role of the US dollar. It has been a source of a lot of US power and prerogative. The fact that about 60% of world trade is denominated in dollars and settled in dollars. And the US banking system is the predominant mechanism for clearing transactions. And the SWIFT system, which is how the US banking system settles transactions, is the instrument by which the US excludes Russia, for example, under the sanctions. I believe that in 10 years from now, the role of the dollar will be much, much less than it is today. And in 20 years, we'll have a very different international monetary system. And the U.S. will have lost what was called by de Gaulle an exorbitant privilege, but it will have lost a privilege of having the key currency in the world. I think there are three reasons for this decline that will come, that's already underway. One is that to be the world currency depends on being the predominant economy in the world. And as the U.S. share of the world economy diminishes, it's natural that the role of the U.S. dollar would diminish as well. And we are, as I said, on a gradual, gentle decline, not gentle, but gradual decline of the share of world output due to the U.S., not mainly because of the U.S. collapse, but mainly because the rest of the world develops economically, like China. So that's one reason. The second reason is much more pertinent to this evening, and that is the U.S. began to weaponize the dollar roughly a decade ago. So it basically began to use the dollar as a geopolitical instrument. And my advice is, if you are a government that isn't getting along too well with the U.S., hold your reserves in some other currency. Because the U.S. has developed a bad habit of seizing foreign exchange reserves of governments that it doesn't like. And it has done that with Venezuela, with Iran, with Afghanistan, with North Korea, and now with Russia. It views that as an easy thing to do. Stroke of a pen by the president, and your antagonist, your foe, can't use their dollars anymore. We even did that with Afghanistan on the way out, froze all the foreign exchange reserves so that the economy completely collapsed in that impoverished place afterwards. It's nasty, by the way. But more than being nasty, it also is not something you can do over and over again, because other countries start to say, maybe we'll hold our reserves in renminbi, thank you, or maybe we'll hold them in some other currency, thank you. And that's what's happening now. So that's a second reason for why the dollar will decline, because it's not just a money, it's an instrument of geopolitics, which it should not be. You can have one or the other, but you can't have the geopolitical instrument for very long. You won't have the key currency anymore. And the third is technological. I think that transactions will not be settled through commercial banks in the future in anything like the way they are now, because we will have digital central bank currencies, and we don't need the commercial banks in the long term to settle our transactions. Probably the digital renminbi will be a first digital currency, probably for use within China, but then it will start to be expanded internationally. Several other central banks will make digital currencies. This is quite different from crypto. Crypto is you have an electronic account that's nonsense and you think it's going to hold value. It's every day I wake up, sorry to say if you're Bitcoin lovers, every day that Bitcoin has any value at all, I think the world's still crazy. So Bitcoin has no intrinsic value, and it's not a legal reserve currency for anything, and it's not a legal means of payment, and it's not a national fiat currency which can at least settle your debts internally. It's unbelievable that people spend money for this electronic cipher. And this arrest of this kid in the United States should tell you this is a little crazy. But what I'm talking about is something else, which is a central bank currency, because there, a digital central bank currency is just a means of clearing payments rather than writing checks like we used to do, or even making electronic ledgers through Venmo we use in the United States and so forth, whichever e-wallet system you use. The central bank can do that, actually. And I think that we'll go to that kind of settlements. And so the U.S. ability to say, we're going to cut you off from SWIFT, so what? So I think in 10 years or 15 years from now, it'll be quite a different international monetary system.
And my question is, what is your vision of the role of Russia in the future in the conflict of US and China? Thank you very much.
The role of
Russia in the conflict between the US and China.
the role of Russia in the conflict. Look, basically, much of the world, as I say, is going to have trade relations with China because why not? It's a good trading partner. And China will be the world's main trading partner for a significant majority of the world. And Russia is among them, and physically being neighbors so that Russia can make gas and oil pipelines and provide other raw materials which China doesn't have, makes them very complementary economies. And since the U.S. has designated both of them as enemies, it makes them natural allies. We did the one thing that Zbigniew Brzezinski said, never do. Zbigniew Brzezinski was, the geopolitical strategist who in 1997 said how important Ukraine was for this geopolitical competition. But in his book, The Global Chessboard, he says, well, this will be the geographical pivot of Eurasia, but the one thing the United States must never do is drive China and Russia together. And then he says, but this is very unlikely to happen. And so, it's the U.S., you shouldn't declare enemies this way. It doesn't even make sense on your own terms of your own geopolitical competition. And that was Nixon's idea of triangulating between Russia and China, or Soviet Union and China, during the Cold War period. But we did what we were told, oh, that will never happen because it's such a bad idea. So right now, that is a friendship without limits, as they say, because the U.S. is targeting both of them. And the U.S. is talking the European Union into more and more of an anti-China policy. And I just can't believe it that Europe would fall for this. Because Europe, absolutely for its prosperity, needs a good relationship with China. And for a long time in the future, China will be a neighbor of Europe in Eurasia. And so you're actually on the same landmass too. And so having good relations would be a good thing, but not in the US mindset. And so the US has launched a chips war against China. This is incredible, this chips war, oh my God. I need an hour to say what I wanted to say, but I'll say it in 1 minute.
There's one more question.
The U.S. has said we're going to try to stop the Chinese economy from, modernizing at the front level by restricting the sale of advanced chips. Terrible idea in my view. Completely belligerent. But yesterday, apparently, according to the Financial Times, I don't know whether it's definitive or not, Netherlands said we go along with this. If Europe just follows the US on this, it's not going to defeat China, but it sure is going to boomerang against Europe. It makes no sense. And what Europe should be saying to the United States is, calm down. You're still powerful. We still like you. You don't have to, you're still richer than China per capita. You can calm down. We don't want a war with China too. And that's what Europe should really be saying to the United States for its own
Thank
good.
you, Jeff. But there's one more question, and I really have to make an exception, because I really don't know what would have happened if I don't allow this, but my wife actually wants to ask a question.
This is a
catches
perfect-
me by surprise, so Natasha Yeremich wants to ask a question.
What is the current situation of climate change? That's the
Okay, an easy question. Current situation on climate change. It's hot and getting hotter fast. And just to give you a couple of grim realities on this, the rate of warming of Earth on average has been 0.18 degrees Celsius per decade during the last 30 years. So that means that Earth has warmed by about half of 1 degree C over the past 30 years. Earth is now warming currently at about twice that rate, at about 0.36 degrees Celsius per decade. Now, compared to the pre-industrial temperature, the Earth is 1.2 degrees warmer than it was before industrialization. If you take 0.36 degrees C per decade, that means we'll be 1.56 degrees Celsius warmer than pre-industrial 10 years from now. That means we will be above the limit set in the Paris Agreement within 10 years. And according to my favorite climatologist, Dr. James Hansen, who I've relied on for decades, and he's been right on everything he's told me for decades, he thinks that in the next few years, when we go from the La Nina cycle in the Pacific Ocean to an El Nino, which raises the Earth's temperature on what's called an interannual basis, we could have an excess beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius, the Paris limit, within the next 5 years. The next big El Nino. We're in a La Nina right now. All of this is to say, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any doubt at all about global warming, it's real, it's serious, it's accelerating, and it's going to create a terrible mess no matter what we do. But if we don't do what we need to do, it's going to create a catastrophic mess.
What should be our response to Mr. Putin with your thoughts on war and aggression after the human atrocities that are reported?
Yeah, I was attacked in the Atlantic for being on the side of peace. And I confess I'm on the side of peace. I am very worried that we are on a path of escalation to nuclear war, nothing less than that. We have essentially a war in which Russia feels that this war is at the core of its security interests. The United States insists that it will do anything to support Ukraine's defeat of Russia. Russia views this as a proxy war with the United States. And whatever one thinks about this, this is a path of extraordinarily dangerous escalation. And I am very fearful.
Right. You lived this with Yeltsin. You were there for Gorbachev and Yeltsin and the rest. I remember when you got off the airplane at JFK, essentially shattered over the collapse of that first experiment. Do you have a feeling that Mr. Putin is alone? Is his military in support of him?
A lot of the world is watching the events in horror, and a lot of the world doesn't like this NATO expansion, which they interpret as at the core of this. They want to see compromise between the U.S. and Russia. In vote after vote in the United Nations, basically it's been the Western countries that have been voting for sanctions and denunciations and other actions, whereas most of the world, certainly most of the world counted by population, is on the sidelines. They just view this as a horrible clash between Russia and the United States. They don't view this as we describe it in the media as an unprovoked attack by Russia on Ukraine. That's, anyone in the United States, they'd say, well, what else is it? But that's because the way that our media have been reporting this. This conflict goes back a long time. It didn't start on February 24th. 2022 in fact, the war itself started in 2014, not in 2022. And even that had antecedents. And so most of the world doesn't see it the way we describe it, but most of the world's just terrified right now, frankly, because it's unbelievable to be hearing on one side, well, we'll use nuclear weapons if we need to, and the other side saying, you can't frighten us.
Well, and Professor Sachs, I share the concern, and I'll be honest, I spent the weekend also reading articles about the U.S. coming up with counterattacks and proposals of what they would do in response to some of these attacks. It's definitely a big concern. It's also an issue as you see this sea change in the economic trajectory in Europe and beyond. And some of this does come from the energy crisis. But suddenly we're talking about inflation that we have not seen since World War II, since potentially another time of incredible distress and military intervention. How close are we to some sort of, I don't want to say hyperinflation, but persistent inflationary impulse well above target in Germany, in the euro area, as they look to these alternative ways to suppress the peripheral region from getting out of control as they raise rates in the front end?
Well, Europe is in a very, very sharp economic downturn. The sharp decline of output and living standards also shows up as a rise of prices. But the main fact is that the European economy is getting hammered by this, by the sudden cutoff of energy. And now, to make it definitive, the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, which I would bet was a U.S. action, perhaps U.S. and Poland. This is
Hey, Jeff, we got to stop there. That's quite a statement as well. Why do you feel that was a U.S. action? What evidence do you have of that?
Well, first of all, there's direct radar evidence that U.S. Helicopters, military helicopters that are normally based in Gdansk, were circling over this area. We also had the threats from the United States earlier in this year that one way or another, we are going to end Nord Stream. We also have a remarkable statement by Secretary Blinken last Friday in a press conference. He says, this is also a tremendous opportunity. It's a strange way to, it's a strange way to talk if you're worried about the piracy on international infrastructure of vital significance. So I know this runs counter to our narrative. You're not allowed to say these things in the West. But the fact of the matter is, all over the world, when I talk to people, they think the U.S. did it. Just to tell you, and by the way, even reporters on our papers that are involved tell me privately, of course, but it doesn't show up in our media.
Professor, I don't want to get into tit for tat about what did or did not happen with Nord Stream, because I don't have the evidence and we don't have a counterbalance to this. There is an issue, though, that's at the heart of what you're saying, which is a lack of trust in the United States, a lack of cohesion in allies in the midst of incredible political as well as economic strife. I mean, do you see the likelihood of working together at a time when there are such disparate interests and feelings of distrust?
The biggest problem is that we have major geopolitical conflict, not only U.S. and Russia, but also U.S. and China. So, and again, with a tremendous amount of provocation coming from the U.S. side as well. So we're breaking any sense of stability right now. For the moment, many in Europe are saying, well, the U.S. is our closest ally. We need to hold on. But watch what's happening politically. There's upheaval in Europe, country after country right now. We're entering a period of enormous instability, and we're unstable in the United States as well. We went through an insurrection. We're still not past that. So we're entering the most unstable geopolitical era in many decades. We're entering the first hyperinflation in more than 40 years, and we're entering the first escalation to the nuclear precipice in 60 years. 60 years exactly this month was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and this is the most dangerous moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's an extraordinary overload, and we see no attempt to tamp this down, to quiet it down.
every day is about escalation. We're going to defeat the other side. We have our rights. We can stand up what we want. We have Speaker Pelosi flying to Taiwan.
Right.
So many provocations in the midst of huge instability.
Jeffrey, we're going
it's
to have to
not-
leave it
it's-
there. Jeff Sachs,
Okay.